It was made very, very clear that all of the attractions there were not for us. That was for, underprivileged children and children that were terminally ill that couldn't go to Disneyland.
It was touted as the most magical childhood home on Earth. Ferris wheels turning, train tracks winding through the estate, unlimited freedom. At least, that's what Michael Jackson wanted you to believe. Decades later, his daughter Paris is pulling back the curtain on the house that captivated the entire world and exposing a truth that turns everything we thought we knew completely on its head. Because the real mystery of Neverland isn't what was inside, it's who was being kept out. Let's get into it. The fantasy everyone believed. Neverland Ranch was never just a house. It was 2,700 acres of Southern California land that Michael Jackson purchased a full decade before Paris was even born. And he didn't just live there. He built an empire of imagination on top of it. A private amusement park complete with a Ferris wheel, a zoo stocked with exotic animals, a 50-seat movie theater, a fully working train and its own station. Because apparently, regular transportation wasn't magical enough for the king of pop. He named the property after Neverland, the fictional paradise from Peter Pan, where children never have to grow up. And for years, that name did more storytelling than any headline ever could. For 3 decades, the public narrative around Paris, her older brother Prince, and her younger brother Biggie, formerly known as Blanket, was simple, almost too simple. These were the luckiest kids on the planet. They had a zoo in their backyard. They had their own private carnival, permanently open, permanently theirs. Tabloids painted a picture of 3 children who never had to ask twice for anything, growing up inside a theme park built entirely around them. That image didn't come from nowhere. Photographers, biographers, and even some of Michael Jackson's own public appearances leaned into the fantasy, framing Neverland as a monument to childlike wonder that his own kids got to enjoy every single day. It became shorthand in pop culture for excess and privilege, the kind of detail that made its way into late-night jokes and magazine profiles alike. Nobody was asking the 3 people who actually lived there whether any of it was true, mostly because for years, none of them were talking. But according to Paris herself, sitting down for one of her most candid interviews yet, that image is almost entirely wrong. And it's not like she's speaking into a vacuum either. Call Her Daddy has grown into one of the most listened-to podcasts among women anywhere in the world. And Alex Cooper's platform now reaches an audience large enough to reshape public perception in a single episode. When Paris sat down across from her, she wasn't just giving an interview. She was handed a rare opportunity to correct 30 years of assumptions in real time, to millions of people at once. So what was actually going on inside those gates while the rest of the world imagined a permanent playground? A childhood that wasn't what you think. Here's where the story starts to unravel. Paris didn't even grow up at Neverland the way most people assume. She told Alex Cooper directly that her time living on the ranch was limited to only the first few years of her life. Not her whole childhood. Not even most of it. Some reports suggest that the family lived on the estate from the year she was born in 1998 until around 2005. But Paris herself is clear that her personal memories of actually living there cover a much shorter window than that timeline suggests, before the family's living situation changed entirely. And what filled her actual days at Neverland wasn't roller coasters or private zoo visits. It was routine, plain and simple. She woke up and she went to school, just like any other kid, except her classroom happened to be a room inside the estate rather than a building down the street. Paris confirmed she was homeschooled, describing a version of daily life that sounds almost aggressively ordinary for a home famous for its zoo and amusement park. Wake up, walk to the classroom, sit through lessons, repeat, chores, homework, rules. That was the real rhythm of life behind those gates, not the whirlwind of entertainment the public had imagined for 30 years. Paris has also spoken about the family moving frequently during those years, a detail that pushes back even further against the idea that Neverland was some unchanging, permanent playground she never left. It's a far cry from the version of her childhood that's circulated in magazines and documentaries for years, the one where 3 kids supposedly spent their days feeding giraffes and riding a Ferris wheel whenever boredom struck. Paris's own account replaces that fantasy with something almost defiantly mundane: a classroom, a curriculum, and a schedule that any homeschooled kid from any background would probably recognize immediately. So, if the rides and the animals weren't a daily perk for the Jackson kids, then who exactly were they for? The access Paris never had. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Paris revealed that access to Neverland's attractions wasn't a birthright. It was a reward, and not even a guaranteed one. She explained that if she and her brothers did their chores, finished their homework, and behaved the way they were supposed to, then on the weekends, they might get to see some animals, ride a few rides, or catch a movie in the estate's private theater. Might. Not automatically, not as a daily privilege, as something earned occasionally, like any other kid negotiating for screen time or dessert. And when the Jackson kids did earn a reward for good behavior, it apparently wasn't always some exclusive, only in Neverland experience either. Paris has described being taken to places like Chuck E. Cheese and Circus Circus as rewards for completing her chores. The same kind of outings countless ordinary families use to motivate their kids on a random Saturday. Picture that for a second. A child with a private zoo and amusement park a short walk from her bedroom, celebrating good behavior with a trip to a pizza arcade like any other kid in America. It's a detail so ordinary it almost sounds made up, and yet it's coming directly from the person who lived it, not from a tabloid trying to sell a headline. But the part that reframes everything is what Paris said next about the ranch's real purpose. She made it clear that the attractions at Neverland were not primarily built for her or her brothers at all. According to Paris, those rides, that zoo, that movie theater existed largely for underprivileged children and kids battling terminal illness, children who otherwise might never get the chance to experience something like Disneyland. Michael Jackson reportedly organized regular visits for sick and disadvantaged kids to come enjoy the ranch, turning his private property into something closer to a charitable retreat than a personal playground built for his own children. It's an almost complete inversion of the story the public has told for years. Rather than a private amusement park existing to entertain 3 privileged children, Paris describes something closer to a foundation with a family living quietly on the same grounds, an estate whose main function, at least according to the daughter who actually lived there, was generosity toward children the world would otherwise overlook. Even outsiders got a closer look at the estate than most of the Jackson kids' friends ever did. The entertainment program E.T. was invited for an on-camera tour of the property in 2003, just months before everything at Neverland changed forever. Think about that timeline for a second. While the public spent decades assuming Paris and her brothers had unrestricted run of a private carnival, camera crews were literally walking through the same gates on assignment, documenting an estate that, according to Paris, functioned more like a rotating charity destination than a family playground. It's a detail that flips the entire narrative on its head. The rides Paris rarely got to enjoy were, by her own account, more accessible to strangers on a press tour or a group of visiting children than they were to her on an average weekday. So what happened next that turned this fantasy estate into the center of a national scandal? The investigation that changed everything. Later in 2003, the same year E.T. walked through those gates for a friendly tour, investigators raided Neverland Ranch as part of a criminal investigation, and Michael Jackson was booked on charges of child molestation. It was a case that dominated headlines around the world for years and put both the ranch and the man who built it under a microscope, unlike anything either had faced before. 2 years later, in 2005, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all criminal charges. He never returned to live at the property the same way again. After the trial, he largely abandoned Neverland, and the estate that once buzzed with private carnival rides and organized visits for children in need slowly went quiet. its gates closing on a chapter of Jackson family history that had already begun fading years before the public realized it. By 2020, an investor purchased the property for a reported $22 million. A steep discount from its original asking price, changed its name, and closed the gates to the public for good. The zoo animals, the amusement rides, and the train had already been dismantled and removed years before the sale even went through. The fantasy land that defined so much of the Jackson family mythology simply ceased to exist. It's worth sitting with just how fast that transformation happened. A property that once required its own train station to move guests around now sits behind gates that don't open for anyone. Its rides gone, its animals relocated, its name erased from public record. For a family whose childhood was already misunderstood by outsiders, watching the physical backdrop of that childhood disappear entirely adds another layer to a story that was never as simple as the tabloids made it look. But with all of that history hanging over the ranch, how does Ferris actually feel about the father who built it? The moment Ferris had to grow up fast. Long before this podcast interview, Ferris was already thrust into a spotlight most adults couldn't handle, let alone an 11-year-old. When Michael Jackson died in June of 2009 at the age of 50, Ferris stood up at his memorial service the following month and spoke, a moment that was broadcast to a global audience and remains one of the most emotional pieces of footage connected to the Jackson family to this day. Ferris has since revealed that the moment wasn't planned. She described it as something that just happened in the moment, unfolding on stage almost before she or anyone around her had time to process it. When asked whether she felt pressure in that impromptu instant, Ferris admitted she still hasn't gone back to watch the footage of herself speaking. She said it felt like it happened very slowly, in real time, but that someone had to say something, and neither of her brothers was stepping forward to do it. So she did. That single moment, an 11-year-old girl finding words for the world while grieving her father in real time, says as much about who Ferris Jackson is as anything that happened behind Neverland's gates. It's the kind of memory most people spend a lifetime trying to process privately. And Ferris did it in front of millions before she'd even finished elementary school. What makes her recent comments about that day so striking is the honesty in her admission that she still can't bring herself to rewatch it. 17 years later, the moment remains something she experienced rather than something she's reviewed. A small but telling detail about how grief doesn't necessarily get easier just because the world moves on and stops watching as closely. So after carrying that kind of weight since childhood, how does she describe her relationship with Michael today? What Ferris really thinks of her father. Despite everything the public has debated for decades about Michael Jackson, Ferris's own words about her dad remain strikingly warm. When Alex Cooper asked how she would describe him, Ferris didn't hesitate. She called him a really funny guy and said flatly that he was her best friend. She acknowledged that it has taken her a long time to get to where she is now, a rare admission that processing her relationship with her father and with his complicated legacy hasn't been simple or quick. But she also made clear that she and her siblings honor him in their own way, adding that she doesn't necessarily expect the rest of the world to understand how they choose to remember him. When asked what story she wants people to walk away with about her father, her answer was just two words: love and light. Not a defense, not a denial, just the framing she's chosen to carry forward, decades after his death. That kind of restraint is notable given how much noise still surrounds Michael Jackson's name nearly 2 decades after his death. Ferris could have used a platform as massive as Call Her Daddy to push back point by point against every headline that's ever been written about her father. Instead, she offered something simpler and, in its own way, more powerful: a daughter's memory, unfiltered by the need to convince anyone of anything. So beyond her father's legacy, what else did Ferris open up about during her hour with Alex Cooper? The life she's building now. Neverland wasn't the only thing Ferris got candid about. During the same conversation, she opened up about getting sober in early 2020, a milestone she's spoken about as one of the most significant turning points of her adult life. She also discussed the end of an engagement, offering listeners a rare glimpse into her approach to relationships and self-love after the split. Ferris used the platform to look forward as much as she looked back, revealing that new music is on the way, with an album set for release later this month. The conversation reportedly wove between heavy family history and lighter territory too, including her thoughts on astrology and what she calls her own Saturn return, the astrological milestone many use to describe a period of major life transition in one's late 20s. It's a strikingly full picture for a single sit-down interview. Grief and gratitude, discipline and reward, sobriety and new beginnings, all delivered by a woman who spent the first years of her life behind the gates of one of the most famous properties in celebrity history. What's clear from the conversation as a whole is that Ferris isn't interested in being frozen in the public's memory as a child who once lived at Neverland. She's actively writing a new chapter, one built on sobriety, music, and self-reflection. Even as she remains willing to revisit the chapter everyone else can't stop asking about. That balance, honoring the past without being defined by it, may be the real headline buried underneath all the Neverland talk. So what's actually left of that property today, more than 3 decades after Michael Jackson first built it? Neverland today. The estate that once housed a zoo, an amusement park, and a 50-seat theater is unrecognizable now. Renamed by its new owner after the 2020 purchase, the property has been stripped of nearly every trace of the fantasy world Michael Jackson built. No rides, no animals, no public tours, just quiet, private land, where a very public childhood once unfolded behind locked gates that the world spent 30 years imagining wrong. For Ferris, revisiting that chapter of her life on a podcast watched by millions wasn't about setting the record straight for the sake of nostalgia. It was about correcting a story that's been repeated as fact for 30 years, that she lived inside a permanent amusement park built just for her, free to ride and roam whenever she pleased. The truth, by her own account, was far more disciplined, far more ordinary, and in some ways, far more generous than anyone gave Neverland credit for. Whether that reshapes how the public remembers Michael Jackson's most famous property, or simply adds one more layer to a legacy that remains endlessly debated, is now up to everyone watching to decide. What's clear is that Ferris Jackson chose to have this conversation on her own terms, decades after she had any control over how the world first told her story. As a child, she had no say in the headlines written about her family, no say in how Neverland was portrayed, no say in how a criminal trial reshaped public perception of the home she grew up in. As an adult sitting across from Alex Cooper, she finally got to narrate her own memories, in her own words, without a tabloid filling in the blanks for her. That shift, from subject of the story to author of it, might be the most significant thing to come out of this interview, more significant even than the details about chores and Chuck E. Cheese trips. It's a reminder that the people we've spent decades reading about in headlines were, and are, real kids, who grew into adults with their own perspective on the childhoods everyone else thought they understood. Now that you've heard it straight from Ferris herself, does Neverland still feel like the fantasy the tabloids sold us? Or has her version changed the picture? Let us know in the comments. Are you Team Fantasy or Team Reality? If this video pulled back the curtain for you, subscribe and tap the bell for more stories celebrities are finally telling in their own words. And don't forget to like this video. It genuinely helps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.